Okay, so this is where we're at. We're at to now, just again, just as I just mentioned, we're at that line between understanding when is it time to do an intervention approach versus a prevention approach to helping people either primarily not end up with a substance abuse disorder or addiction versus when it's time to actually provide some type of intervention. Okay. So to begin, we should note that there's two kind of diagnostic criterias that we look at when we're looking at assessment. The first one is substance use disorder. Okay. This is where we have a dependency on some type of drug. And we should mention, even though this class is primarily on drugs and substance use, this can also be things like dependency on the need for gambling. It can include sex addiction. It can include video game addiction. And in the DSM, there's actually several categories for each of those. So I just wanted to know, while we're focusing on substance use, this can be taken into other types of addiction. But there's a dependency and then there's an abuse of it. Now, dependence is that the person can't function without using that substance. That's dependence. Abuse is when the individual uses more than what would be quote unquote recommended. So it's when a person goes from, let's say, 2 to 3 drinks a week to 2 to 3, 5 to 6 a night. Okay. And so you see this escalation of dependence and abuse. Okay. On the other hand, there's substance-induced disorder. Okay, this is where a person is not necessarily dependent on the substance, but when they use a substance, they use it beyond just, for example, catching a buzz or getting that euphoric feeling by drinking, quote unquote, a couple beers, that they drink to the level of intoxication. And then there's withdrawals for several days after. Um, if you want to kind of think about the difference between these, this substance use disorder is someone who uh, uh, uses on a continuous basis, where the substance induced disorder are binge drinkers. So they may be able to go, 4 or 5 days without drinking or using, but then they go into a complete intoxication, drinking 5, 6, 7, 10 drinks at once. And then they have to spend the next day or two going through the withdrawals of that binge. Okay. So this is kind of the way to kind of think about the difference between these two types of disorders. So what are some of the behavioral definitions of addiction? If we have substance abuse and then we have addiction, what are kind of the hallmarks of what we would assess when we're dealing with someone who now has an addiction? And there's three, it's called the 3 C's: compulsion, control, and consequences. Okay. So the compulsion is the obsession with that alcohol and drugs. It's when the individual cannot get it out of their mind. They continually think about it, about when they're going to use next, how they're going to use. If they're trying not to use, they're constantly looking for excuses to use and to drink and use drugs. Okay. Control is the inability to stop using that alcohol or drug. So there's attempts after attempt, but over and over the individual fails to stop the use. Okay, this is often what's called testing. So someone will say, okay, I'm not going to drink for the next 5 days. And they set up a false reward that on the 6th day, they'll reward themselves with a drink. Okay. Well, what they're doing is just setting themselves up for failure because what they do is on that sixth day they drink, and then the seventh day again, and then the eighth day again, and they get stuck back into that cycle. Okay. So it's that inability to maintain control over non-use. Okay. And then the third C of addiction is consequences. Consequences is that continue the use despite the adverse consequences. So this is it sometimes will start off with just an individual not showing up to work once in a while, and then not showing up to work every Monday because they use completely through the entire weekend. And then it's coming up with constant excuses that work isn't getting done, bills aren't getting paid, credit cards are starting to build up with the liquor store as the primary recipient of those credit debits. And so, despite all the debt and the consequences to work and family, the person continues its use. In fact, they use it as an excuse to reduce their stress because of the consequences of drinking. So they're maybe on probation at work, or they can't meet their financial obligations. That becomes stressing, and then it becomes an excuse to use. Okay. So it's this vicious cycle of the want, the desire, the obsession, and then even with adverse consequences, using those adverse consequences as further excuses to continue using the substance. Now, assessment for drugs and alcohol occurs at different levels. Okay, so assessment occurs at stages. Um, so one, we could look at it from, I believe, I just want to make sure I'm thinking of this right. So we start with, for example, children are less likely to develop chemical dependency if parents, okay? So do not model alcohol and drug use and encourage healthy approaches to life. Encourage children to develop a strong sense of self and promote positive alternative activities to alcohol and drug. So why is this important to the assessment of drug and alcohol when you're looking at, for example, what have children learned about use and whatnot? Okay. If these things are present and the person is abusing, then this means that you're marking them kind of high on the risk model. Okay. However, if they didn't have parents who modeled this, and there's still use, then that's another kind of flag too. Okay, so it kind of goes both ways when it comes to the assessment stages of alcohol and drug use. So we know that it's when we're sensitive to children's feel while parents are setting appropriate, provide structure, discipline, and consistency, and develop a climate of discussion. Okay. So these are all what we call protective factors, especially when it comes to children with alcohol and substance use. Absence of these factors, one, the child can develop alcohol and abuse early into childhood and into adolescence. But also we know that if these aren't there, that as adults, that it's more likely of having a substance use disorder. Okay. Set and setting also matter when we're looking at assessing these things. So it determines the person's reaction to alcohol and drugs. So one, set psychological and emotional frame of mind, the person mind of a person when using alcohol and drugs. And this kind of goes back to the beginning of our conversations when we talked about the different theories of why individuals tend to psychologically and emotionally abuse alcohol and drugs. And We can do it from a persona perspective. So there's people who psychologically and emotionally feel that they're unavailable when they are not using. They're funner to be around. They convince themselves that they think clearer. I don't know how many alcoholics I've interacted with who claim that they're better drivers when they're loaded versus when they're sober. And all those psychological and emotional frameworks that the person is in when they're using alcohol and drugs. We also need to look at the setting, and this involves the physical setting. The is a what condition is the home in, for example, the social conditions. So, do they have appropriate social relationships? Do they have friends that are non-using friends? Do they have family support, or has the family kind of given up and thrown in the towel? Okay. And then the interpersonal environment, which is really intimate relationships and emotionally close relationships, for example, with families. How distant is the person and whatnot? And this can go back to things like family dysfunction, like what we talked about in the first week or so of class. is is there so much social and interpersonal dysfunction that the person uses alcohol and drugs to escape that social interpersonal world? Okay, so here we have some kind of periods that we can look at when we're looking at um, um, use. Okay, so again, if we were to draw some lines, we can see some prevention periods, right? Non-use, and then we have initial contact with the substance. Now, after that initial contact, that person may choose to stop. So there are people who use a substance and choose not to use it anymore because of adverse side effects, or they didn't get the expected high or expected result, or they just didn't enjoy it socially and psychologically. Okay, so that's a stopping point that can occur. Okay. um Experimental and situational circumstance use. So this can initial contact, then goes into kind of that experimentation, kind of using once in a while. And this can result in periodic excessive use of drugs. So if you want to think about this, this is the line that is going to lead to continued use. This periodic in each of these situations lends itself to those binge periods that we talked about. Okay. So after experimental, you use it every once in a while. You maybe use it situationally. So there's, what we call social drinkers. They only drink when they're in social situations. There's the person that can have a beer at night, but it's not to excess. Those types of individuals that use based on circumstance, but they don't necessarily need it. They don't necessarily crave it. Okay. But then we get into integrated use. Okay. Integrated use is when the substance becomes part of the person's functioning. And this is where we're getting between the line. Whoa, sorry about this. This is where we're going to start seeing the line between primary prevention and secondary intervention and secondary. Okay. Integrated use is when the person starts to use not as an addition to their life, not as oh, it'd feel good to have a drink tonight, for example, but when that drink becomes a necessity for that night, or when that drug becomes something that needs to be part of a situation. So this is when a person, for example, can't go to a party without having a drink, or when they get home, they have to have, the full 12 pack. Um, um, so it becomes an integrated part. Once it becomes an integrated part, though, if it's not stopped here, so this is where we would be doing some type of intervention. We'd be saying, oh, you know what? It's becoming dangerous. And maybe we get the person to stop. If not, if continued use does occur, we can get into excessive use. And this is when we start again going from the 1 or 2 beers a night to 12 to 24 beers a night, or when we're binging, going from 4 shots a night to 12 shots a night. Okay. And so it becomes more and more excessive, and it really starts taking over the person's functioning. And again, going back to previous statements, is when people stop uh, doing their work responsibilities, their home responsibilities, their financial responsibilities. Okay. Now, you will note that in this developmental process, these two arrows that say return, okay, a person can go to excessive use and then go, wait, this is too much. I'm being unhealthy. And they can go back to maybe integrated use where they only use some here and there, and it's still an important part of their life. And they could even go back to circumstantial use where they go, okay, I'm only going to drink on Saturdays, or I'm only going to drink on Sundays. Okay. The issue is that this then, if it's not stopped at one of these places somehow, it becomes a cycle where the person will go from experimental back to integrated use, back to excessive use, and then they'll test themselves again, and they'll go through this cycle over and over and over. Okay. Now, once this cycle has gone through its um, challenges, the person challenging, oh no, I'm using too much. Oh, okay, I'm going to go back to one drink a night. Okay, no, I'm going to only drink on the weekends. But I like having it. And they start making those kind of excuses, those cognitive errors. Okay. Once this cycle has gone through its ultimate end, this is where we end up in addiction. Okay. And this is when if you want to think about it, addiction is all three of these combined. Okay. Which is when we now have severe intervention. This is when we're looking at medical, probably detox, probably inpatient addiction recovery, and those kinds of things. And so this is something to think about when you're looking at the stages. And if you get in when you're in the field, or you're looking at developing prevention, intervention programs, you can look at where the person is, where the individuals are, to try and kind of help determine at what level of intervention is needed, or prevention if we're more up on this end of the spectrum. Okay. So here's, if we look at some, for example, the phases that are very common with cocaine addiction. This is tends to be a different kind of different way to look at it. Okay, so when we look at initial contact, isn't this a great drug? I mean, it makes me feel good. It gives me energy. Many report the Superman, Superwoman type of thing. Uh, I know a couple colleagues who almost wrote their entire dissertation in a weekend on a cocaine high. That sounds bad. Don't do that. It didn't end up well for them. Um, but um, but it's where you just have this super energetic, your mind is open, all of these kinds of things. The problem is it only lasts about 40 to 50 minutes. Okay. So then you get into the experimentation where you kind of say, well, it's sure expensive, but it's worth it, right? So you keep experimenting on the use. So how do you get it to last the longest? How do you get it to what amount? Okay. And then you get to excessive use. I really need to cut down. And then finally in the diction, I know I have to stop, but I can't. Okay. And those are some common things that research done by Rawson in '89 found with cocaine users. These are very common statements that they made during each of these phases of cocaine addiction. Okay. When we look at, for example, early and late stages of alcohol and drug use, okay, and this is another way to think of the difference between, ah, keep doing that. The difference between, again, prevention and intervention. Okay. Pre, pre, pre prevention in the early stage is the idea that the drug provides more freedom, fewer risks, and less damage, possible abuse. There's no illness, linear operating factors. Okay. So, in the early stages of especially substance use disorder or alcohol use disorder, is that in the early stages, you don't feel that it's that much of a risk, or you don't feel the physical damage that it's doing. Okay. And we tend to think of it as linear. I'll use on Saturdays and I won't use from there on out. Okay. Um, when we get to late stages of addiction, though, we find that there's a lack of freedom. Okay. I know in the early stages of the legalization of marijuana, when states started to legalize, I had quite a few friends and acquaintances who restricted their traveling to only those states that had legalized marijuana because they knew they couldn't fly to a state where it was illegal and all those kinds of things. And so they were restricted into where they could go as far as trips. I knew some individuals who avoided business trips and whatnot because of the geographical isolation that that substance provided. Okay. We also know that once you start, building up debt, not being able to have access to other things, those all limit your freedom and your ability to be mobile. A lot of alcohol abusers will sit, even when they're in detox, don't have the ability or the desire to go out to eat with someone or go visit family. They tend to avoid going places where that substance isn't used or there. Okay. Um, in the later stages, we see more damage, of course. We see, I worked with someone um, who had comorbidity. I was working with her primarily because she had borderline personality disorder, but she also became very addicted to alcohol. And the more and more she got into the alcohol, when I first worked with her, she got assistive housing in a brand new home, and it was a beautiful little home. It was wonderful. By the time the substance abuse really took hand, there were holes in the walls, there were doors broken down, there was grime all over the floors because of the consequences of aggression that alcohol can cause, all of those types of things. The person stopped taking care of things and started to become very agitated. Okay. And this is where, again, the idea of present abuse. There really is no substance. There's maybe some evidence with marijuana some of the hallucinogens that don't create aggression, that there's an absence of abuse. And when I say abuse, I'm meaning abuse of self and abuse of others. Okay. And this is both abuse of the substance, but also abuse of other individuals. Okay. Where aggression and taking advantage of other people become very present. Okay. And then state of illness. You probably have seen in the commercials for methamphetamine and opioids the before and after pictures of individuals. And that has a lot to do with the damage that many of these drugs cause to, if it's an inhalant, to the lungs and heart, if it's a substance, to the liver and kidney. And all of those organs are gateways to more severe types of disease states. Probably one of the most common, for example, with alcohol substance abuse is obesity and diabetes, as states of illness as part of the inability to stop use, because alcohol has a significant effect on your pancreas. In fact, pancreatitis, 99% of pancreatitis comes from alcohol abuse. Your pancreas is also responsible for the production of things like insulin and sugar regulation. Okay. So that effect on it can then cause those other states of illness. And then it becomes a vicious cycle where there's the contemplation of quitting, the testing of quitting, the then the use, then deeper into the use, and then that vicious cycle going over and over and over. Okay. So this is one way to view what should we be looking at when we should say this is a time for intervention, meaning severe integration of treatment and therapy and those kinds of things, versus the early stages where we may be able to do more of preventative stages of getting the person from not going into the full late stage addictive process. Okay. Then when we're starting to look at what would be considered tertiary prevention. So remember, we have primary, secondary, and then we have intervention, and then we have tertiary, which is trying to help the person after they've went through recovery and treatment. How do we help them not re-enter that addictive cycle? So this is in our field, in this field of substance use, this is what we call relapse. So tertiary prevention and relapse prevention can be seen kind of interchangeably within our field. Okay. Um, and we have to understand that at each stage of recovery, the individuals are vulnerable for relapse. So when we talk about recovery, that means going into detox. Okay. There are individuals who, when they're driving to detox, will use. Okay. When they're going through inpatient or outpatient treatment, and then when they're going through relapse prevention, all of these areas are vulnerable for the individual to go through relapse. Okay. And this is why treatment programs usually address relapse, and you usually do a relapse prevention group or relapse prevention program really early on. It usually starts around about after the third or fourth week of individualized treatment of some type. Okay. Um, and we also need to note that when we're in that late stage of addiction, that more longer term inpatient and residential program may be needed in order to keep the person from relapsing. Okay. And there are no criterias or description of different types of relapse exists. And what this means is there's no real one reason why a person relapses. There's no real biological, psychological, or social kind of description of what is the common reasons or types of relapse a person will go to. It's really idiosyncratic, meaning that it's very much individual based. And that's why relapse prevention programs, even in the group setting, everybody's situation needs to be taken singularly, that each individual shouldn't be seen as everyone will go to relapse if you do XYZ. No, it's much more individually based, and high risk situations are differ from person to person. And of course, when we were talking about this, and I think we've talked about this before, one of the biggest issues of um, uh, uh, drug treatment, as far as assessing and helping a person through it, is the issue of denial. Um, and this partly has to do with our history of how we've treated people with substance use. And we've mentioned this before in this class in the first 2 weeks about how people who excessively use tend to be seen as weak. They can't control themselves. Uh, that they're a problem. And so, who wants to admit that, one, I have a problem, and two, I'm weak and I can't stand on my own two legs? So it's when denial, if you want to put it this way, is using this acronym. Uh, don't even know I am lying. And when it says that, lying to myself and lying to my family. Okay. And by individuals who have drug problems, family and friends and society. Okay. And this is lying to myself, lying to my family, friends, and society. But they don't see it as a lie. They see it as a defense mechanism. It's more of an unconscious defense mechanism to deny a problem, such as minimization and rationalization. Okay. So a person may be on the edge of losing their job, but they might minimize it and say, but they're not going to fire me. They'll keep me. Or they may say things like, oh, I don't need that job anyways. Okay. Or they may rationalize their use, saying, you know what, when I use this substance, I'm a better person. Um, uh, Alcohol is legal. In Arizona, marijuana is legal, so it's okay to use those things. Tobacco is legal, right? And so using that rationalization, and they're both kind of defense mechanisms to the notion of denial. Consequences of minimization and rationalization. So these are the consequences of those things that we just talked about. Neglect and emotional, physical, and sexual abuse. And we definitely see this with really kind of hardcore drug addicts who end up needing to, for example, sell their body in order for use. They tend to both be neglectful and emotional and physically abusive, not only towards themselves but towards others. Okay. Statistically, statistically, when a woman becomes homeless in a metropolitan area and has to sleep in her car or on the street, statistically, she is at the highest risk of being sexually assaulted within 24 hours. Okay. So when we look at when this comes to things such as addiction leading to homelessness and leading to losing jobs and not being able to return home, these are some of the real risks that the individual may face, especially again when we're talking about women who become homeless, which is really uh, that statistic has always stuck in my mind because I've worked with several victims who experience just that. So it's something to keep in mind. And then there's loss, trauma, divorce, separation, losing those who we love, all those kinds of things. When I've looked at some, when I worked with couples who had really codependent kind of substance use issues. So probably if they separated, they could probably go through treatment and probably be okay and whatnot. But because they're together, they feed off of each other's addiction. Their social circles become smaller and smaller and smaller. There was a couple I worked with who had a rich religious community, close to their family, had lots of friends. They were the place that everyone went to barbecue with. But within a year of their addictive cycle, once they really got into the addictive cycle, they were pretty much just them two home alone, and no one wanted to go visit them or be around them. Okay. And that's an example of the loss and the death and trauma and things that it can create. Numerous relocations and unstable home environment is very common. And parental dysfunction, creating feelings of parental unavailability and feelings of abandonment when the parent finally is like, I can't take this anymore. I can't let this person's addiction take over my life. There tends to be a lot of resentment on the addict's end because of those denials and minimization and rationalization of their substance use. So when we're talking about adolescence, there are some signs that can lead to alcohol and drug problems. These are very common. The thing that I would caution about this list is these are not, some of these can be associated with alcohol and drug use, but they can also be associated with other social and psychological things going on in the adolescent's life. So when you're seeing these different red flags, as you would say, it is important not to go directly to alcohol and drugs, really to take the person from a holistic perspective. These tend to be in combination very common of a alcohol and drug use problem. So mood swings, I know for example, individuals, I'll tell a personal story. When I was a kid, my older brother, who was 2 years older than me, for a short time got addicted to speed, and his mood would change just in a flash pan. Even if he wasn't even dabbing speed at the time, just in a moment, he could go from super calm to super aggressive and get very, very physically aggressive just from just a flip of a coin. Okay. And this is where we also get into changes in who our teens hang out with, for example. Changes in desires to, for example, if they're playing a sport, deciding, I don't want to do that anymore. Sudden changes. Um, Responsibilities starting to not meet familial responsibilities, motivation levels, school performance, negative activities, and then, of course, lying, stealing, and cheating. And all of these probably sound like kind of no duh, kind of general things, but these are all kind of in combination are meant to start to kind of tell the story of what's going on in the adolescent's life and are things to kind of look out for. But again, some of these things may be due to other situational, social, or psychological factors. So be careful with using these as the person is actively using. It's just the warning signs, if that makes sense. So, so I think we'll end here today because this kind of wraps up everything we've talked about so far. Is so what are the hallmarks of an assessment? Okay. Well, first, we often start with the age of initial drug use, drug or alcohol use. The earlier the age, the more likely they're going to be in the cycle of drug abuse and it be a long-term issue versus something that we may be able to do a brief intervention on. Okay. Frequency, amount, set, and settings of use. Okay. Going back to the idea that it's gone from once a week to every night, from 2 to 3 drinks a night to 6 to 7 drinks a night. Okay. And settings is it's bleeding over into other areas of life. So it's not only happening at home, they're sneaking drugs or alcohol to work, to school, and those kinds of things. Okay. Patterns of use. Is this a binge person? Are there periods of non-use? Okay. Because remember, going back, there's those two types. There's our binge person, and then there's our a life, if you want to put it, lifestyle type person. Stage of current use, going back to that linear graph we went through. What is the reasons they're using? Okay. Medical history. Again, it's very common that you will see before the substance use, before this initial age of use, the person was relatively healthy, but now they're starting to have heart problems, leg and muscular problems, skin problems, maybe diabetes, the development of diabetes, liver and kidney issues. So all of those things start to build, and you can see this almost if you put their medical history by their substance use history, you kind of see this progression of illness. Okay. Use of coffee, cigarettes, and medications. So when it comes to this, is a lot of substance users, especially alcoholics, will use a large amount of coffee because alcohol is a sedative. So in order to function through the next day, they'll use large amounts of coffee. With people who uh, um, are addicted to things like methamphetamine, cocaine, those drugs that overstimulate the dopamine system, cigarettes and nicotine tend to damper the things like delusional or paranoid thinking that comes along with those. And so it helps calm them down. It helps get rid of the paranoia that especially individuals who are meth addicts have. And then medication. Again, going back to alcohol use, you often end up with a lot of muscle soreness, muscle deterioration, arthritis. And so you will see the overuse of things like Tylenol, the overuse of ibuprofen, and all those types of medications. Okay. And these are all things to kind of, when you're doing the history, to kind of look at and kind of go, okay, where is this person in their addictive process? And then from there, what you'll do is start to build a treatment plan. But I think for today, we're going to stop here today, and then tomorrow we will get into some of the physical consequences of alcohol and drugs. And so I am going to stop my sharing right now. I'm going to